Today, I'm going to be talking about Byzantine art, which is the art of the Eastern Roman Empire, whose capital was Constantinople, or present-day Istanbul. And the empire survived for over 1,000 years, so there's a lot to cover. A bit of background first. What exactly was the Eastern Roman Empire? It was founded by Emperor Constantine the Great in 330, and he renamed the old town of Byzantium New Rome, but almost immediately it was known as Constantinople after him. But historians use the old name Byzantium to describe the art and the name of the empire. It was about 17 years later that Theodosius I became emperor, and he established the Nicene Creed, or Creed of Constantinople, as the orthodox doctrine for Christianity, and he was the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire before it was permanently split, as you see here, between the West and the East. For a period of about 80 years, there were two separate co-equal courts dividing the governance of the empire into the western provinces and the eastern provinces. But in 410, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, and the critical date 476, Rome's power was ended when the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, regarded itself as a continuation of the whole Roman Empire, with Constantinople as the new capital. And it lasted over 1,000 years until eventually it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So, over this 1,000-year time span, the Byzantine Empire had some 93 emperors divided into 17 dynasties and 4 non-dynastic periods. The first emperor was Constantine the Great, shown here. Now, Byzantine art is best known for its mosaics, its religious icons, its architecture, its carved ivory. And you can divide the whole period into, or roughly into, 3 periods. The early period lasted about 500 years, 330 to 842, and it was during that period that the Hagia Sophia was built, and the Ravenna mosaics were created, and within this early period, the reign of Justinian I was important. I'll be talking more about that because he reinvigorated the arts. Now, Byzantine art broke away from the naturalistic Greek and Roman tradition by adopting a more symbolic approach, but you can see here that it was actually a combination of the naturalistic and the symbolic. The early period, this early period of 500 years, was ended with a 120-year period of iconoclasm, when much of the art was destroyed. And you see here the image of Christ being whitewashed over. Then, during the middle period, sometimes called the High Period of 350 years, art flourished. There was a return, as you see here, to classical forms, a renewed interest in the human body, and art diversified, was influenced by the West as well as by Islamic art. And then there was a late period of about 200 years, which saw a revival of Byzantine art, characterized by emotional intensity and dynamic movement. And as you can see here, there are some similarities with early Italian art. This was followed by a post-Byzantine period when the style was continued in Crete. And this Cretan school's most well-known exponent today was El Greco. And then much later, from the 19th century onwards, there was a revival known as Neo-Byzantine. So let's go through all of that a little bit more slowly. And also what I'd like to do is to introduce some of the history to put the art in context. So let's return briefly to the history of Constantinople. The history of the old town I mentioned, Byzantium, predates Constantinople, and there was an enormous hippodrome which was built by Septimius Severus in 203 Common Era. The layout of the hippodrome you see on the far left is all that remains. There's no hippodrome, just the road following the layout of the hippodrome, which is now in Sultanahmet Square in modern-day Istanbul. But in its day, the hippodrome could hold 100,000 spectators, and it was filled with art, statues of gods, emperors, animals, heroes, and so on. In the modern-day square, there is the serpent column, which I thought I'd mention because Constantine brought it from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and it dates from about the 5th century BCE. It celebrates the victory of the Greeks over the Persians. There's also in the square this Egyptian obelisk, which dates from 1490 BCE, and it was brought from the Temple of Karnak at Luxor by Theodosius the Great. Note on the map, the grey area is, or was, the Great Palace, now long gone. The only remains are this solitary pier now in the courtyard of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. But the Great Palace was the main imperial residence of the Byzantine emperors until about 1081, and it was the centre of administration for the empire for over 690 years. There are a few fragments of the Great Palace, its foundations and a mosaic, but little has survived. So let's return to Constantine I, known as the Great, who gave his name to Constantinople. This is the head of what was once an enormous statue. The head is over 2 meters high, and this is a recreation of what the statue might have looked like based on the few pieces that remain. And this recreation is made from resin and was made in 2024. So it's a recent reconstruction, just to show you the size. In 313, Constantine agreed the Edict of Milan, which ended the persecution of Christians, and then in 380, Christianity was made the state religion of the Roman Empire, the Edict of Thessalonica. Now, Constantine only visited Rome a few times and decided the empire needed a new capital, and that's why he chose the Greek town of Byzantium. And he renamed it in 330 New Rome, but as I said, it quickly became called Constantinople. He chose it, incidentally, as it's situated on the Bosphorus at the junction of Europe and Asia. And from then on, it was the capital of what became known as the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. And it saw itself as the continuation of ancient Rome, that is the whole empire. Incidentally, it wasn't until the 17th or 18th century that it became known as Istanbul, which is medieval Greek, imtimbolin, which means to the city. And that became, because it was the only city around, the Greek phrase to the city became the name of the city. For a while, both names were used, but Istanbul was first used on coins in 1730. This is an ivory carving of an Eastern Roman general called Flavius Ariobindus Dagalifus Ariobindus, and he was the consul in Constantinople. And here in this ivory carving, you can see mythological figures, military victories, allegorical representations of the virtues, and it was intended to convey power, prestige, and legitimacy. Ariobindus is shown at the top seated, presiding over the games, which is one of the reasons I'm showing it to you, in the Hippodrome. And the Hippodrome is at the bottom. And you can see at the bottom animals devouring, fighting with gladiators and other people. Now, Ariobindus was born into a distinguished family. In fact, his father, his grandfather, as well as his mother's father and grandfather were all consuls in Constantinople, and he married the daughter of the Western Roman Empire emperor. And you can see here in his right hand he holds a handkerchief, a cloth called the Mappa Circensis, which is a map of the circus or a map of the Hippodrome, and it was used as a signal to start the games. In his other hand, he's got an elaborate sceptre, and he's flanked, as you see, by two assistants, and he is the one sitting on this luxurious chair. His power and prestige was such that at one point, according to chroniclers, the populace took up the cry, "Ariobindus for emperor," and marched on his house to proclaim him, but he heard they were coming, was unwilling to take part in a coup, fled the house and went into hiding. And in fact, historically, nothing further is known about him, and it's assumed he died not long after. This is a photo I took of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. It's a 6th century church. It was actually begun, the construction was begun in 526. And it's an important example of Byzantine architecture and inside of art. You may wonder why Ravenna. Well, about 100 years before, early to mid 5th century, Ravenna was the capital of the Western Roman Empire until the German Odoacer is the one who overthrew Romulus Augustus, the last emperor, marking the end of the Western Roman Empire. Now, in this basilica or church, the central building, as you see, is orthogonal. There's a dome, and you'll notice, interestingly, the use of flying buttresses, normally associated with the much later Gothic churches. The church is best known for its mosaics, which are the largest and best preserved outside Istanbul. And around the central section there are two ambulatories, and you can see the windows of the ambulatories, one above the other. We think the upper one was for married women. Inside, this is the apse. An apse is a large semicircular recess in a church typically with an arched or domed roof. And this mosaic shows a youthful depiction of Jesus Christ seated on a blue globe, robed in purple, flanked by angels, offering with his right hand the martyr's crown to San Vitale, and on his left, Bishop Ecclesias offers a model. He offers a model of the church, and according to legend, the church was erected on the site of the martyrdom of Saint Vitalis. On the side walls, either side of the apse, there are two famous mosaic panels, and this mosaic depicts Emperor Justinian I, who stands in the middle. He has soldiers to his right and clergy on his left to make it clear that he was the leader of both church and state. By the way, the inscription above and to the right of his head was inserted later and refers to Bishop Maximian. But the halo around Justinian's head appears to give him the same holiness as Christ that I showed you in the dome of the apse. But it is just part of a tradition that members of the imperial family are shown with halos. On the opposite wall, there's a more elaborate panel showing Justinian's wife, Empress Theodora, solemn and formal, with a golden halo, crown, jewels, a group of court women on her left and two eunuchs on her right. She's holding the Eucharist vessel for the precious blood, and her panel differs from the one I just showed you of Justinian, as it's got a more complex background. As you see, there's a fountain over on the left, a cupola or rounded dome above her, and lavish hangings over on the right. There are many other mosaics in San Vitale. There's the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, Moses and the burning bush, Jeremiah and Isaiah, and the story of Cain and Abel, and on the side walls the four evangelists. This is Hagia Sophia, built in this form by Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora in just 4.5 years. It was the third of 3 churches to be built on the site, and when it was built, it was the world's largest interior space and the world's largest cathedral for nearly 1,000 years, until Seville Cathedral in 1520. And even now it's acknowledged as one of the greatest buildings in the world. It was a staggering work of Byzantine architecture. It was intended to awe all who set foot in the church. And for the rest of Byzantine history, it was the centre of Christian worship in Constantinople. This is the dome inside looking up. The church contains some of the most sophisticated mosaics of the Byzantine period. The artist who created them imagined idealised images, as we'll see later, that reflect their spiritual essence, and the goal was to instill awe and to give the feeling to the viewer of occupying a spiritual realm. One Byzantine scholar, Procopius, said of the dome, "It seems not to be founded on solid masonry, but to be suspended from heaven." This is one of the mosaics in Hagia Sophia. It's the Desis mosaic, considered by some to be the finest mosaic. It depicts on the left the Virgin Mary, and on the right John the Baptist, either side of Christ Pantocrator, which Pantocrator literally means almighty or all-powerful. Interestingly, some art historians believe that the faces of the Virgin and John the Baptist were originally portraits of Justinian and Theodora, later changed, and that happens a lot with mosaics. They're modified over the years, so exact dates and intentions are unclear and are still actively debated. And some believe the underlying structure of this mosaic might date back to the 6th century rather than the 10th or 13th century, although that's the date of the final version. By the way, Empress Theodora, who I've mentioned, was one of the most fascinating and influential figures in Byzantine history. She had a humble background, so she was from poor beginnings, but married the Emperor Justinian when she was 35. She managed to quell riots, the Nika riots. She, with a powerful speech, she was a shrewd political strategist, but she also championed women's rights and introduced new laws on divorce and prostitution that protected marginalised women. She supported religious tolerance and commissioned many public works and many art projects. In particular, she financed mosaics in Hagia Sophia, a strong, ruthless and ambitious woman. We don't know how she died. There was a plague that swept right through the empire between 541 and 549, which she died in 548. So it's possible she was killed by the plague, but that's not recorded. This is interesting. If you do visit Istanbul, you should visit the underground water cistern. It's about not far, 150 meters or so from the Hagia Sophia, built in the 6th century by or during the reign of Justinian. On the site of an ancient Roman basilica, there are 336 columns supporting the ceiling, incidentally recycled from the ruins of older buildings, a process called spoliation, and the material taken from the old buildings is called spolia. The cistern, when it's filled with water to the top, can hold 80,000 cubic meters of water, and the water comes from a forest about 12 miles to the north. It's claimed that 7,000 slaves were involved in the construction of the cistern, and you might recognise it from a film, From Russia with Love, the James Bond 1963 film. But if you do remember the film, the cistern, the water cistern, is not actually under the Soviet embassy. I mentioned this earlier. It shows a mixture of styles. First of all, in the centre, the Virgin Mary sits between, on the left, Saint Theodore, and on the right, George, holding martyrs' crosses. Behind them, there are two ethereal angels looking upwards to God, and you can just see the hand of God coming down in the centre. The angels, the heads of the angels, are well modelled in 3 dimensions, as is the Virgin's, and her face has a realistic appearance, similar in a way to Coptic tomb paintings. Notice Mary and Christ avert their eyes, so they're not looking directly at us, but the two saints are staring directly at us, suggesting that they're a conduit between us and the heavenly realm. The background is not just plain gold, but represents a wall with an alcove for the Virgin's throne. So it's a mixture of styles, elements of 3-dimensional classical painting, but also elements of pure symbolic painting, but mixed together. And overall, it has a consistency, it has a vivacity and a stability that creates a powerful relationship between us and another world. So in other words, it's a form of, it's a liminal space, a gateway from the everyday world to the spiritual world through the saints, to the Virgin Mary, and then up to God. And I should mention that at this point, during the reign of Justinian and Theodora, the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest extent, which you see here. As you can see, it stretched around a large part of the Mediterranean and included many modern-day countries: Turkey, Greece, Egypt, Italy, southern Spain, and so on. But we've reached a period sometimes called the Byzantine Dark Ages, the first iconoclasm. The first lasted about 61 years, the second 29. In total, about 100 years. And during that period, mosaics and other images were destroyed or whitewashed over. The ban was strictly imposed, and we can see here the torture and martyrdom of the icon-loving Bishop Euthemius of Sardis on the left, by the iconoclast Emperor Michael II, who's sitting on the right. And that was during the second iconoclasm. Although this, as you can see, is from a much later, a 13th century manuscript. Iconoclasm, which of course is the destruction of all religious images, is motivated by a theological interpretation of the Ten Commandments, or a strict interpretation. The commandments from Exodus and Deuteronomy forbids the making of graven images. And in fact, the commandment is quite clear. Let me read it. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Which seems to rule out all images. So why raises the question of why the Catholic Church allows any images? Well, the justification following this period of iconoclasm is that it distinguished between idols, that is, images that are worshipped themselves instead of God, and religious images which serve as aids to prayer and devotion, if you like, a graphical or pictorial representation of the text of the Bible to make it the stories in the Bible clear. So it's that distinction between idols and religious images, and the interpretation of graven images referring only to idols. Maybe a fine distinction that the Muslim world doesn't make, although at the time it didn't actually have a formal policy of iconoclasm. But the Byzantine Emperor Leo III did, and he banned all religious images, and then the ban was further strengthened by Constantine V and Leo V. What's shown here is a 9th century text from the Bible. The text is, they gave me gall to eat when I was thirsty. They gave me vinegar to drink, with a picture of a soldier offering on the right Christ vinegar on a sponge attached to a pole. And then reflecting that, there's a picture of the last iconoclast patriarch of Constantinople, John VII, and he's rubbing out or whitewashing a painting of Christ with a similar sponge attached to a pole, and John is caricatured. Look closely and you'll see he's got sort of sticky up straight hair sticking out in all directions, and that was intentional and meant to portray him as wild and barbaric in his iconoclasm. So in other words, this is a picture criticising iconoclasm, and from a later period. So following that period known as the Dark Ages, we reach Middle Byzantine Empire, the Middle Period. It was Michael III that ended Iconoclasm and brought in a revival of Byzantine art with an emphasis on spiritual expression. This is the Joshua roll. It's interesting because it's a continuous roll about 10 meters long, which of course is common in Chinese art, but unique in medieval Christian art. And this roll tells the story of the Old Testament book of Joshua. Unfortunately, it's incomplete. It starts with chapter 2. And it shows, the story of Joshua, his military successes. And you can see here that that's what's going on here on the left and the right. There's conquered kings kneeling in abeyance, paying homage to Joshua. And again, this also reflects the military successes of the Byzantine Empire at this time. Sheet 12 through the roll shows an angel on the left in commander's uniform appearing before Joshua, and Joshua is shown twice standing on the right and also prostrate, kneeling or lying in abeyance before the angel. Incidentally, the woman sitting on the right personifies Jericho. She represents Jericho, and it's a convention found through the roll. The way you can tell is that on her head she's got a tower, and so she represents, as I said, Jericho. Unusually, in this roll, the images take precedence. The text is truncated to fit and is written around the images, as you can see here. And the poses and the landscape setting are inspired by classical Roman art. And there was a revival in Roman and even classical Greek mythology, as we see here on what's called the Veroli casket, and its use of a form of classical Hellenistic style. Let me show you a close-up of the lid. This is the Rape of Europa. You can see the bull, which is the Greek Zeus or Roman Jupiter, king of the gods, disguised himself as a bull to abduct a mortal woman who's sitting on the bull's back. But there are many mythological inaccuracies. So either the maker didn't have access to the original classical texts or didn't care, just ignored them. For example, there's no indication of water. The bull went out across the seas, so it's normally the bull is shown with waves beneath it. And also this group of unruly boys on the right with throwing stones is not part of the original myth. It possibly is from the Old Testament, the stoning of Achan in the story of Joshua. And so, if so, it's a sort of merging of biblical stories with classical or elements of classical mythology. The person over on the far right playing the musical instrument is, I think, Hercules. So classical mythology combined with biblical stories. We've now reached, in the 9th to 11th centuries, the Macedonian Renaissance, so-called. And this really shows classical influence of this period. We could be looking at a Roman wall painting, a fresco, but this is in fact an illuminated manuscript, the Paris Psalter, containing the Psalms of David and a series of prayers, a popular subject for private devotion. It's depth, composition, naturalism, its colouring, its quality make it unique for this period, 10th century. In the Psalter, there is an extensive glossary explaining the prayers, and with the royal iconography and the quality, the sumptuousness, it indicates it was for a learned imperial patron, which suggests it was Constantine the Seventh who ruled from 913 to 959. What we're looking at here is one of the scenes of David's life. He's shown playing this form of harp with Melodia behind him. Melodia is not a Greek goddess. It's the symbol. It symbolizes, Melodia symbolizes music. Behind there's a woman looking out from behind the pillar over on the right. I think that's the nymph Echo, and Echo was cursed by Hera and was unable to say anything because of the curse other than the last thing she'd heard. So all she can do is repeat David's music. And then bottom right is a figure that looks a bit like Hercules, but I think it's Mount Bethlehem, shown as a shepherd, thus the sheep, referring to David's role as a shepherd before becoming king, and also to Bethlehem, known as, of course, as the city of David, but also a reference to the birthplace of Christ. So a lot can be read into these illustrations. Back to Hagia Sophia, and this is a representation of Christ with the Emperor Leo VI, possibly his son Constantine VII, bowing down before Christ. In the medallions, on the right is Archangel Gabriel, and of course on the left is the Virgin Mary, and Christ is holding a text which reads, translated, "Peace be with you, I am the light of the world." Now, Leo VI was the second ruler of the Macedonian dynasty and was extremely well read, leading to his epithet, the Wise. It's Leo the Wise. And this is quite an interesting mosaic. The tessera confirmed the work was executed by experts with verve, spontaneity. The tessera have been carefully analysed, and they're angled downwards at various angles between 9 degrees and 15 degrees, which give the optimal result for an observer standing beneath in the doorway opposite. As the sun moves, they scintillate in the sun. This is an ivory relief panel from this period. It's what you're looking at is a legend concerning 40 Roman soldiers who refused to recant their Christian faith, and they were condemned to a painful death by being forced out onto a frozen pond. And there's heated bathhouse you can see on the right, which was on the shore for those that recanted, but only one did, and he was replaced by one of the guards. So there were still 40 martyrs. The half-naked soldiers, the martyrs, are shown packed together on the lower half. Some doubled in pain, some have collapsed, and above sits Christ with 3 prostrate angels on each side, ready to receive them into heaven. Another mosaic in Hagia Sophia, and by the way, I've separated out the mosaics so that I can introduce them in roughly the correct sequence chronologically, but as many of them were modified over the years, it's needed a bit of manipulation. But this is a mosaic of Empress Zoe on the right and dates back to the 11th century. She's holding a scroll that represents the donations made to the church in the form of written promises. And on the left is a mosaic of Emperor Constantine the Ninth holding a bag of coins, which also is a donation to the church. And Christ sits on a throne in the middle, wearing blue robes, holding the Bible, and his gesture is a blessing. Empress Zoe is interesting. She was born into royalty, into the royal dynasty, briefly ruled with her sister in 1028, but when her sister died, she was pushed to one side, although she remained a powerful force in the background. And in 1042, when she was 64, she unexpectedly ascended to the throne and was the first woman to rule on her own in Byzantine history. She then faced challenges to her power and decided to marry Michael IV, who was a young noble, and she married him and adopted him as her son and made him the emperor. But it wasn't a happy marriage, and there were power struggles which led to his death, followed by two more husbands with power struggles again, until her final marriage to Constantine the Ninth, which brought stability and prosperity. And as I said, I think it's Constantine the Ninth that's shown on the left here. This is the welcome to the 12th century. This is Emperor John Komnenos, and during his reign, he was a very respected emperor, even by the Crusaders, respected for his courage, dedication and piety. And in fact, he gave his name to the Comenian period, when there was great experimentation and diversification in the art, and the art became influenced more by the Western art at the time and Islamic art. This, for example, is one of the frescoes in the church of Panteleimon, and it shows a new level of emotional intensity and a new naturalism in the art. The quality of the frescoes in this small church, which is in North Macedonia, suggests the artist there came from Constantinople to paint the frescoes. John the Evangelist is holding Christ's hand, and his body creates a sweeping contour that leads the eye to Mary holding Jesus' body in her arms, suggesting, it might remind you of the that composition and posture reminds you of Giotto's 14th century fresco in the Arena Chapel, sometimes called the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. Which moves us on to the late Byzantine Empire, following the sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Crusaders, leading eventually in 1453 to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. This is a much later work. It's Tintoretto showing the capture of Constantinople prior to the sack. To me, almost unbelievably. I know all the reasons historically, but almost unbelievably, in 1204, Venetian and French knights of the Fourth Crusade captured and then burnt and pillaged Constantinople and murdered and raped the inhabitants, and much of the art was destroyed. I say unbelievably because the Crusaders and the inhabitants of Constantinople were both Christian, and the aim of the Crusaders was to journey on and recapture the Holy Land from Muslim control. In the event, it seems, and I won't go into all of the reasons and the toing and froing, but it was politics combined with greed, lust, and an instinct to destroy that led to the wanton, unnecessary and unjustified sack of the city. Well, the sack of Constantinople was pivotal, and although the Byzantines regained the city in 1261, from that point on the empire was small and weak and confined to Constantinople and a few islands in the Aegean. And in this late Byzantine period, there was in fact a brief flourishing of art and literature. It was the empire was ruled by Palaeologos, and it became known as the Palaeologos dynasty and the Palaeologan Renaissance between 1261 and 1453, when it fell to the Ottoman Empire. It's said that the migration of Byzantine scholars, some who went to the west, also helped spark the Italian Renaissance. But as I said, although there was this brief flourishing, it never recovered fully following the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders. And because it was so weakened, there were numerous raids by Turkish Muslims, Bulgarians, and so on, capturing parts of the former large empire. There were two disastrous civil wars as well. There was the Black Death, 1348, and then an earthquake in 1354. And by 1380, the former empire was reduced to more or less Constantinople and a few small isolated areas. The Chora Church on the outskirts of Constantinople is the finest example we have of the mosaic work of this late period. The church dates right back to Constantine, but was rebuilt. This is one example showing Mary and Joseph registering for the census of the Roman aristocrat Quirinius. And during this period, there was a last great outflow of art. This Renaissance was, although Constantinople was small, this Renaissance attracted scholars, poets, artists from across the world, the then Western world, and a glittering court emerged as the effectively dispossessed intelligentsia gathered together, united by a hatred of their enemies. This Palaeologan dynasty was the created landscapes, pastoral scenes, summers mosaics, summers frescoes, harking back to the classical period, but also influenced by the developments in Western art. I should mention, before leaving this period, that there was another skill possessed by Byzantine artists, which I haven't mentioned, and that is the ability to create micro mosaics. And these became very popular. They were created by Byzantine artists until at least the 12th century. And there aren't many left. We have about, about 20 examples. And this is one in the Louvre, St. George and the Dragon. They're quite small, usually less than 25 centimetres in height. This one's 22 centimetres. And the tessera are tiny. They're no bigger than a pin's point, set in wax on a wooden ground. So they became a sort of a luxury item, something that the wealthy wanted to possess. They were collected, in other words, by rich patrons in Byzantine era and period, and also wealthy people in the West. Another part of this final revival of Byzantine art is the emotional intensity and dynamic movement and interest in secular themes. But here I'm showing a church in Macedonia, the frescoes inside the church. And if you look at the fresco in the middle there, I'll show you a larger and better quality version. This is one of the most admired frescoes of the Paleologan Renaissance. The composition and postures suggest, as I said just now, a connection with Giotto's 14th century frescoes in the Arena Chapel. And it's Giotto di Bondone can be seen as the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, particularly in this, perhaps his most famous fresco, Lamentation of Christ. So the suggestion here is the influence of these Byzantine art on some of the earliest work of the Italian Renaissance. Note the use in both pieces of perspective and the realistic representation of human expression and emotion. We reach the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire, 1453. This is a representation produced in France only a couple of years after the event. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine X was defeated by the 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II, who made Constantinople the new Ottoman capital. Following the siege, the city was again looted, women and children raped, the elderly and sick killed, and 30 to 50,000 citizens forced into slavery. Anyone who resisted was put to the sword, and it was reported that the ground in the city could not be seen as it was heaped with corpses. This is an enormously significant event, the fall of Constantinople, as it marked the end of the 1500-year-old Roman Empire. And many see this event as the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern period. In fact, the Byzantine art did continue in Crete. The Cretan school, as it's known today, gradually introduced Western elements into its style, and you can see here an early work by El Greco when he was still a resident in Crete. And this was some 300 years later that the Byzantine style was still continuing. As I said, this was an early work by El Greco. From Crete, he travelled to Venice and then Rome before moving to Toledo in Spain, which is where he remained until his death. And this work, Vision of St. John, was part of an altarpiece that he produced for the Hospital of St. John the Baptist in Toledo. It's a scene from the Book of Revelation. It was exhibited in Paris in 1907 and inspired Pablo Picasso, who was then working on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. El Greco's style is so original that it's difficult to categorise. It was met with puzzlement by his contemporaries, but he was nevertheless commissioned. It can be seen perhaps as a mixture of Byzantine with mannerism and Venetian Renaissance. The drama, the distortions can also be seen perhaps as precursors of Expressionism and Cubism. For example, in the work I just mentioned, Picasso's La Demoiselle d'Avignon of 1907. And then finally, what's called Post-Byzantine artist inspired by Byzantine art from the 19th century onwards are known as Neo-Byzantine, like this Ukrainian artist, Mikhailo Boychuk. Now, Boychuk was Austrian-Hungarian artist who studied in Krakow, Vienna and Munich, and then lived in Paris, where he founded his own school. He held an exhibition at the Salon des Indépendants in 1910, and he revived Byzantine art in this form. And a group of Ukrainian artists who studied and worked with him became known as the Boychukists. In 1910, he left Paris, returned to Ukraine, worked as a conservator in the National Museum, travelled to the Russian Empire, but after World War I, he was interned there because he was seen to be an Austrian citizen. And after the war, Boychuk returned to and remained in Kiev. That brings me to the end. It was difficult to summarise over 1,000 years of art into this short talk, so I hope I haven't missed your favourite work. Thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye for now.